So Princess Anne just detonated a bomb inside Windsor Castle that had been ticking since the final days of Queen Elizabeth's life. And the fallout is genuinely reshaping who holds power in the British monarchy right now. This isn't about a catty family feud or some vague royal insiders whispering to tabloids. Anne walked into a closed family meeting, faced King Charles, Queen Camilla, and Prince William. Anne presented a documented account confirming that the late queen issued a direct warning before her death, a warning that Camilla must never confuse personal closeness with sovereign authority. That word, sovereign authority, is the key to everything. It isn't about being liked or being welcomed at family Christmas. It's about who controls the secret machinery of the crown, the private briefings, the sealed records, the access that determines where real power lives. And Anne just made it clear her mother believed that machinery needed a firewall, with Camilla permanently on the other side of it. Before we get into the specific contradictions and the brutal consequences that followed, hit subscribe to Prime Archive so you don't miss the next deep dive. This story is moving fast and we're tracking every shift. The most devastating part of Anne's revelation wasn't the warning itself, it was the fact that she waited until now to deliver it. Charles didn't hear about his mother's private judgment in the soft days of mourning when grief might have softened the blow. He heard it now, deep into his reign, when patterns had already hardened into habit and Camilla had already settled into a role that felt permanent. Anne chose her moment with surgical precision. She told them that the queen delivered the warning shortly before her death in a private conversation with no aides present, no public record to soften it, and no ambiguity about what she meant. The message was not about affection or ceremony, it was about power and who must never be allowed to blur it. Charles stared at her by multiple accounts, as if the floor had shifted beneath him. He understood instantly why the phrase wounded him. It didn't attack his marriage directly. It questioned whether love had been allowed to move too close to power, and that question placed him squarely between the woman beside him and the mother whose final judgment still ruled the walls around them. Camilla's reaction in that room tells you everything about how precisely this warning was aimed. She didn't move. She didn't ask for comfort or lash out in defense. Anne explained that the late monarch had supported Camilla's public dignity, yet feared any path that might let personal closeness shape sovereign decisions. That distinction cut deeper than anger ever could. It meant Queen Elizabeth had separated acceptance from trust, companionship from command, and marriage from the actual machinery of monarchy. Camilla's silence in that moment told everyone she understood the difference perfectly. She had survived decades of public criticism, weathered the scandal years, and eventually stood beside Charles with the crown's formal blessing. But this was different. This came from the woman whose approval had once seemed like the last closed gate, and it suggested the gate had never fully opened the way everyone assumed. The documented account Anne brought into that meeting wasn't some hastily scribbled note or a memory she was reconstructing years later. It was a written record she personally confirmed before Charles, Camilla, and William. Anne has spent her entire public life building authority through restraint, through never being the dramatic one, through showing up and doing the work without demanding attention. That discipline made her impossible to dismiss now. When she explained that the late monarch had separated family acceptance from institutional authority, the meaning cut through the room with the force of something that had been waiting too long to be said. Institutional authority means the power inside the crown itself. Access to private briefings, sealed decisions, records that shape who knows what first, and the hidden channels that keep monarchy from becoming personal possession. Camilla absorbed that distinction with a stillness sharper than any protest could have been. She hadn't been accused of open betrayal or plotting in the shadows. Anne's words suggested something more painful, that Queen Elizabeth had accepted her place beside Charles while quietly fearing the influence that place might bring. William watched all of this unfold with a guarded face, but his stillness gave him away. The prince had suspected for years that his grandmother drew invisible lines around the institution, boundaries that existed in private memos and quiet conversations rather than public pronouncements. He'd never heard one stated with such force, in a room where the consequences were immediate and personal. As the meeting continued and the weight of the revelation settled, William felt something harden inside him. He remembered how quickly boundaries had softened after his grandmother's death, how informal access could become expectation, and how expectation could begin to look like entitlement. He didn't interrupt. His silence told Charles that the future king had already chosen the side of the boundary. Charles finally asked whether anyone else had heard the warning, and Anne looked down before answering. That pause became its own revelation. Then she named the moment that had convinced the queen the danger was real, and that's where the story really starts to unravel. The incident that triggered everything, that convinced Elizabeth to formalize her warning and carry it to Anne in that private meeting, is something Anne calls the Windsor Blue Folder incident. A quiet afternoon when a sealed briefing meant only for the monarch was moved, questioned, and nearly redirected through the wrong hands. Anne didn't describe that afternoon as chaos, which makes it more chilling. She remembered control, quiet voices, and the kind of careful calm that often hides the deepest danger. The Windsor Blue Folder wasn't just a bundle of papers. It was a confidential household briefing, a private royal file prepared only for the monarch, carrying sensitive notes about access, authority, and future ceremonial limits inside the family. It had been prepared for Queen Elizabeth during a private Windsor review, yet somehow it began moving toward Camilla's office before the Queen had finished with it. Elizabeth noticed before anyone expected her to notice. The monarch had grown frail by then, but her mind still moved with the sharpness of a sovereign who had spent a lifetime reading what others tried not to say. She asked one calm question: where was the blue folder? The room tightened because every possible answer carried danger. If it had gone by mistake, the mistake exposed weakness in the systems meant to protect sovereign authority. If it had gone by assumption, the assumption exposed something far worse: an expectation that Camilla's office should naturally receive materials meant for the monarch. Anne saw her mother's face change, not with anger, not even with surprise. It was alarm, controlled but unmistakable. The kind that passes through a room before anyone dares name it. The folder concerned internal royal access, household authority, and future ceremonial boundaries, matters that shaped who could see private information, who could influence decisions, and who could stand close enough to power to be mistaken for part of it. Elizabeth believed those lines belonged strictly to the sovereign line, not to affection, not to marriage, and not to convenience. That evening, she summoned Anne privately. She didn't speak like a mother wounded by family tension. She spoke like a monarch protecting the crown from confusion. The monarchy, she warned, could survive affection, rivalry, embarrassment, whispers, even pain, but it could not survive uncertainty over who held authority. The warning about Camilla was born that night. Camilla's name didn't enter the story as accusation. It entered as fear. Elizabeth worried that closeness to Charles could one day be mistaken for power over the crown, and that mistake could spread quietly until it became accepted practice, until no one questioned why certain documents moved through certain offices, until the boundary between consort and sovereign became so blurred that the institution itself weakened. Anne buried the warning because her mother still lived and silence felt like loyalty. But after the Queen's death, Anne saw the same pattern returning, the same quiet assumptions, the same gradual drift of access toward people Elizabeth had specifically identified as outside the sovereign line. And so Anne prepared her documented account, waited for the right moment, and walked into that Windsor meeting knowing she was about to reopen wounds that had barely begun to heal. The confrontation that followed didn't begin with shouting. It began with the door closing. No aides, no secretaries, no protective circle of courtiers, just Charles, Anne, Camilla, and William inside a Windsor room where every old loyalty had become dangerous. Anne didn't raise her voice. She placed both hands on the table and forced the king to hear the warning as his mother intended it. Charles demanded clarity, but pain sat behind every word. He wanted to know why Anne had carried their mother's warning in silence, why she had let him step deeper into his reign without telling him that Queen Elizabeth had drawn a line he couldn't cross. Windsor had become more than a family setting. It was the room where private grief collided with royal command, and that mattered because every decision made there could quietly reshape who held access, influence, and trust inside the monarchy. Anne didn't flinch. She had waited because the Queen was still alive, and while the monarch lived, peace had mattered more than confrontation. But after her death, silence became something else. It became risk. The crown couldn't be protected by sentiment alone. Camilla sat opposite Anne with controlled composure, but control couldn't hide the wound. The queen consort had heard criticism before, weathered decades of it, but this struck differently because it came through Anne with the weight of Elizabeth behind it. She finally asked the question no one else dared to ask. Had the queen named her directly? The room tightened around the answer. Anne looked at her, steady and unforgiving in her calm, then said, "She named the danger, and then she named you." William broke his silence only after that. The prince had stayed near the edge of the conversation, listening as son, grandson, and future king. When he spoke, his voice carried no triumph. He told Charles the issue was no longer whether the warning felt fair, it was whether the monarchy could afford to ignore it. Fairness could bend under family emotion, but authority couldn't. Once boundaries blurred, power stopped looking inherited and started looking claimed. Charles didn't answer. He turned away from Anne first, then from Camilla, and finally from William, as if each face demanded a different loyalty. He left the room without resolving the wound, but everyone understood that emotion had failed to settle anything. Because behind the family's pain stood a colder question. Who truly controlled the boundaries Queen Elizabeth left behind? Power in the monarchy rarely announces itself. It sits inside access lists, private seals, locked rooms, and names written on papers few people ever see. After Anne's revelation, the question was no longer whether Camilla felt wounded. The question was whether the queen's final boundary still had force and whether anyone in the family had the courage to enforce it. Anne understood that emotion alone wouldn't be enough. Charles could argue with memory, resist pain, tell himself that his mother's words had been shaped by age or worry, or the heavy pressure of her final days, but he couldn't argue with the access memorandum Anne placed before him. An access memorandum is a private palace record setting out who can view sensitive royal papers, enter restricted rooms, or receive confidential briefings. It matters because monarchy survives not only through crowns and ceremonies, but through control of what remains unseen. Charles read it alone, and anger began to lose its shape. His hand paused over Queen Elizabeth's initials, and suddenly the document wasn't cold procedure anymore. It was his mother's final discipline written into the hidden machinery of the crown. The king had entered the room wounded by Anne's timing, but the words in front of him left no easy path back to outrage. They showed that the late monarch had quietly reinforced boundaries before her death, making sure core sovereign materials remained within the direct royal line. Anne watched her brother absorb the truth, and the cost of her revelations settled over her. She hadn't only challenged Camilla's position near power, she had reopened Charles's deepest grief. Every line he read reminded him that Elizabeth hadn't simply feared a person, she had feared confusion. The sealed correspondence, ceremonial registers, and private briefings weren't ordinary papers. Sealed correspondence meant letters or records kept under restricted authority, while ceremonial registers were official lists controlling roles, access, and precedence during royal events. Whoever controlled them could quietly shape the meaning of power. William saw the structure at last. Anne hadn't been acting out of rivalry or some long-simmering personal grievance. She had been guarding a system the queen built in silence, a system designed to protect the crown from becoming a family possession. Camilla's public dignity remained intact, but the memorandum made one distinction impossible to ignore. Dignity beside the monarch was not the same as authority over sovereign materials. Then came the first consequence, the one that turned the warning from abstract principle into immediate reality. A message was prepared for Camilla's household, calm in wording but devastating in meaning. One privilege would be withdrawn immediately, and when that decision reached Camilla's door, the warning stopped being history and became her new reality. The first loss wasn't a title, a jewel, or a carriage seat. It was access. A quiet message delivered behind palace walls told Camilla that certain private royal papers, once expected to pass near her office, would now be held elsewhere. No public statement was needed. The silence was sharper. For the first time, the Queen's warning had become an instruction. Camilla received the decision with the kind of stillness that made the message feel even heavier. Her household would no longer receive advanced visibility of selected sovereign family briefings tied to Queen Elizabeth's private records. Sovereign family briefings are confidential notes prepared for the monarch and senior bloodline royals, often touching private access, legacy matters, and internal family authority. They matter because they shape who knows what first. And in royal life, knowing first often means standing closest to power. Charles understood the damage before anyone explained it to him. The decision was framed carefully, not as punishment and not as public disgrace, but as restoration of a boundary his mother had wanted protected. That wording made it harder to challenge. If the king resisted, he wouldn't simply be defending Camilla. He would be arguing against Queen Elizabeth's final caution, and that was a wound no husbandly loyalty could easily cover. Camilla sat alone after the messenger left, one hand resting on the arm of her chair as humiliation settled slowly. She hadn't been stripped before the nation or named in a brutal palace statement. Yet the private nature of the loss made it more painful. It told her that the family didn't need public drama to reduce her influence. They only needed to close one quiet channel, and suddenly the distance between her and the crown became impossible to ignore. Charles wanted to comfort her, but hesitation stopped him. He knew every word he offered could be weighed against his mother's warning. If he promised to reverse it, he would stand against Anne, William, and Elizabeth's line of authority. If he accepted it too coldly, he would leave Camilla feeling abandoned inside the marriage she had fought decades to secure. The king was trapped between tenderness and duty, and both demanded something from him. The changes began reshaping the palace immediately. Courtiers stopped sending certain notes through informal channels. William quietly instructed staff that all legacy matters connected to Queen Elizabeth had to move through verified family authority only. Verified family authority means approved routes controlled by those directly responsible for protecting the late monarch's records, not casual access built on closeness or habit. The change was quiet, but it cut deep. Camilla's pain created the opening Charles had tried to avoid. He couldn't hide behind procedure now. He had to choose whether to defend his wife against the warning or confront the truth his mother had left behind. That choice led to the quietest, most revealing moment of all: two people alone without the palace. When the palace machinery stopped moving, only the marriage remained. Charles found Camilla in a private room where no aid could soften the truth. There were no speeches, no protocols, no carefully chosen statements, just a husband facing a wife who felt judged by a dead queen and a king beginning to understand that love couldn't erase a sovereign boundary. Charles entered carrying the weight of two loyalties, and neither offered mercy. He had faced councils, ceremonies, public storms, but this was quieter and far more dangerous. Camilla wasn't asking about titles or seating plans. She was asking whether the woman whose approval had defined so much of royal life had ever truly trusted her. That question mattered because trust inside the monarchy was never only personal. It shaped access, influence, and the invisible permission to stand near power without being questioned. Camilla didn't hide the hurt behind anger for long. She wanted Charles to say that Queen Elizabeth had been mistaken, that Anne had misunderstood, that the warning had been sharpened by fear or age. But the king couldn't give her that comfort. A sovereign boundary means a protected limit around the monarch's private authority, the kind that decides who can enter restricted channels and who must remain outside them. Charles knew that if he dismissed it as family tension, he would be weakening the very crown his mother had guarded for 70 years. He admitted the warning hurt him because it sounded like a judgment on the life he had fought to legitimize. He had waited decades for acceptance, for Camilla to stand beside him without shame, without whispers, without the shadow of old wounds following every step. Now the Queen's final caution had turned that victory into something fragile. It didn't erase the marriage, but it placed a hard line around it, and that line cut through both of them. Camilla's anger slowly gave way to sadness. She began to understand that the warning wasn't a rejection of her place beside Charles. It was a limit on how far that place could reach. The Queen Consort could be honored, protected, publicly respected, but Queen Elizabeth had drawn a difference between being loved by the king and holding influence over the sovereign machinery he inherited. Charles finally told her the boundary would remain, not because Anne demanded it, not because William approved it, but because his mother's final judgment had to be honored. Camilla listened, wounded but no longer fighting the truth. She quietly agreed not to challenge the restricted access, and that single choice prevented the private conflict from becoming a public war. Yet, acceptance inside the palace couldn't stop what was coming beyond its walls. By morning, the warning Anne had guarded in silence belonged not only to the family but to the nation watching the monarchy judge. The public didn't hear the warning as a small palace dispute. They heard it as Queen Elizabeth speaking from beyond the grave. Britain woke to a newspaper front page showing Anne's stern face beside Camilla's lowered eyes under the headline, "The Queen's Final Warning." Suddenly, private royal caution became national judgment. The story felt less like a royal leak and more like an unfinished command. Anne's revelation had escaped the walls of Windsor and crossed into every breakfast table, every phone screen, every quiet conversation about what the monarchy had become after the Queen's death. The warning mattered because it didn't accuse Camilla of a public scandal. It raised something more powerful, whether the late monarch had feared the boundaries of authority were weakening inside her own family. Palace officials moved quickly but carefully. Their response didn't deny the emotional force of Anne's account. It only insisted that family matters should remain private, and that restraint was itself revealing. A palace response is the official wording released to protect the crown from confusion, panic, or uncontrolled interpretation. This one mattered because every word had to do two impossible things at once: shield Camilla from humiliation and avoid appearing to dismiss Queen Elizabeth's final caution. Outside Buckingham Palace, the mood turned solemn. A small crowd gathered quietly, some holding flowers for the late queen as if the revelation had reopened mourning rather than sparked simple gossip. People didn't speak of policy. They spoke of trust. They spoke of Anne waiting until she believed the boundary had been threatened. They spoke of Charles trapped between the woman he loved and the mother whose shadow still reached across the rain. Then one broadcaster gave the story its defining frame. He called it not a rebellion against Camilla, but a restoration of Elizabeth's final line. And the phrase settled across the nation with chilling force. It changed the meaning of the entire drama. Anne no longer looked like a sister challenging the queen consort. She looked like a daughter carrying a message no one else had been strong enough to deliver. William's name rose beside hers in public judgment. The prince was seen not as a rival to Charles, but as a guardian of unfinished instructions, a future king protecting the crown before it could drift too far from the values his grandmother had left behind. Charles appeared more isolated, not weak, but wounded by the impossible pull between love and legacy. Camilla remained dignified, yet the silence around her had changed. The monarchy now had to do more than survive the story. It had to settle it before the warning permanently defined the reign. In the end, the warning didn't destroy the family, it exposed the line they had all been afraid to name. Queen Elizabeth's final caution forced Charles to understand that love could stand beside duty, but never above it. Anne's revelation wounded, clarified, and settled the matter. Camilla remained queen consort, but the crown's private authority stayed where Elizabeth intended. Charles accepted the settlement with the quiet pain of a son who had finally understood his mother's last boundary. Camilla's public role would remain honored, and the queen consort would still stand beside him in the life they had fought to build, but access to Queen Elizabeth's private sovereign materials would stay restricted. Private sovereign materials meant the late monarch's confidential records, family briefings, sealed correspondence, and protected decisions connected to the authority of the crown. Whoever touched those records didn't merely read history. They stood close to the power that shaped the monarchy's future. Anne's documented account was no longer treated as an act of revenge. It became a protective act. She hadn't spoken to humiliate Camilla or weaken Charles. She had spoken because the queen had created a boundary, and boundaries mean nothing if no one has the courage to defend them when the cost becomes personal. Anne carried that cost without triumph. She had waited, watched, and finally spoken when silence itself became dangerous. Camilla accepted the emotional price because she understood what fighting it would do. The queen consort could remain loved by Charles, respected in public, and protected within the marriage, but her place beside the king did not grant control over Elizabeth's legacy. That truth hurt because it separated personal victory from institutional trust. She had won a place at his side, but the crown had reminded her that closeness was not command. William emerged with greater authority, not by taking power from Charles, but by defending the principle his grandmother left behind. The prince didn't need to raise his voice. His strength came from standing beside the line Elizabeth had drawn and refusing to let grief, marriage, or family pressure erase it. Charles privately acknowledged the deepest wound of all. His mother's warning was painful because it was precise and because it asked him to be king before husband. This moment meant the monarchy chose continuity over comfort. Queen Elizabeth's warning didn't erase Camilla, weaken Charles, or divide the crown beyond repair. It clarified the monarchy's deepest rule. Affection may enter the palace, but only duty can govern it. Anne's revelation didn't break the crown. It reminded everyone who it was built to serve, and that reminder, delivered in a Windsor room with no cameras and no escape, will shape the reign of King Charles in ways we're only beginning to understand.